Hello friends, this is Growl. It's an exciting time in WoW right now. The big M+ push week is over, and now Blizzard has announced and released the new Preserved Contaminant system. You can now exchange Echoes of Ny'alotha in the Chamber of Heart for a corruption of your choice to apply to any uncorrupted or recently cleansed item. In the past, I mentioned that corruption is mostly just a matter of putting together the best pieces you have. But now, within a few weeks, most players should have close to the ideal corruption setup they desire. This means we need to rethink our best in slot corruption setup and start planning out what we are going to spend our echoes on. I spent the day looking over my current gear and simming possible corruption setups, and I wanted to share with you my results. But before I get to that, I want to give suggestions as to what you guys should be doing and not doing right now to make sure that you make the best of this new system. The most important thing you need to be doing is collecting coalescing visions and echoes of Ny'alotha. Now that you can buy corruption, these resources are more valuable than ever. Many activities, including M+ and PvP, reward echoes, so playing whatever form of content you enjoy will get you started. Each raid boss rewards echoes, so you should be aiming to full clear the raid every week. Your Mythic Plus and PvP cache also reward echoes, so be sure to cap both of them, even if you're low rated. Each emissary also rewards a small amount of echoes, so if you have extra time, you may end up having to go back to world quests. Completing the major and minor assaults both give echoes and visions as well. Visions are important because they're a great source of echoes and sockets. With the corruption changes, it's very likely that you'll need to get a few sockets on some new pieces of gear that you corrupt. 10,000 visions rewards you one horrific vision, which gives you 750 echoes. This is currently the best source of echoes, so doing the assaults as well as the daily lesser vision will be a great source of corruption now. Another important thing to be doing is acquiring best in slot 475 pieces with tertiary stats from the raid. Previously, these items didn't matter much if you had a better piece with corruption in the slot, but now you will want to apply new corruption to them as minor upgrades. 475 haste mastery items with leech or avoidance from the raid are insanely valuable for you now, because you can apply best in slot corruption and a socket to them. Previously, I was using bonus rolls looking for corrupted items, but now a blank item with leech or avoidance is even better. Now for some things to avoid. You should be very careful with what pieces you decide to corrupt. Remember that certain corruption like Mind Flay or Gushing Wounds scale off of item level, so the best pieces to be corrupting now are the N'Zoth Ring and the Carapace Boots. I think these items will both be best in slot for Resto Druid if they weren't already, and if you don't have them yet, you should be saving your echoes for when you get them, especially if you decide to go with a corruption that scales with item level. If you want my honest opinion, I think you probably shouldn't spend any echoes to corrupt anything right now, unless you desperately needed to play the game. The next 2 weeks in Mythic Plus are pretty bad, and the system is new. There's a chance they make future balance changes with corruption, and also you might acquire better items to corrupt. I know it isn't fun, but my current plan is just to save as many echoes and sockets as possible for the next 2 weeks, until I have a perfect idea on what items I want to corrupt for the upcoming push weeks. If you're progressing on a raid boss, or aiming to reach a certain IO score, then by all means spend what you have. But for the way that I play the game, it would be a waste to spend anything until the next decent week in Mythic Plus. Now on to my sim results. I've decided not to sim my exact optimal gear setup because my gear is very likely in the top 1% of item level and stat totals. I wanted to make sure the sims were more relatable to everyone watching. The stats in this sim are reasonable to obtain with only a few sockets: 30% haste, 21% mastery, and a little bit of crit and verse from good pieces. This will very likely be close to what you're working with right now if you're doing keys around the plus 19 level. If you're pushing high-end keys in the 24 plus range, I'd encourage you to run these sims for yourself, as your results may vary. These numbers are taking into account the proposed Gushing Wounds nerf coming on May 26th, but with no additional changes. Because most corruptions are damage focused, and Mythic Plus is mostly spent damaging single targets, I wanted to start with single target damage. At the top, we have Gushing Wound and Mind Flay 3. These corruptions are your strongest for single target damage, with Gushing Wound slightly ahead. I think Mind Flayt is still worth thinking about because, although Gushing Wounds is slightly better, as corruption resistance increases, you may need more than just Gushing Wounds on every piece to fill your corruption budget. Also, one single Mind Flayt 3 piece on a 485 item will provide a ton of single target damage if you don't have any other pieces you want to corrupt quite yet. A very honorable mention, although not quite at the top, is Expedient 3. Expedient doing almost as much single target damage as Gushing Wounds, while also having the added benefit of improving your healing, make it very, very powerful. Twilight Deb is at the bottom of the list at 50. This might seem low at first, but keep in mind that TD is primarily used for AoE damage, so the fact that it is doing more than half of a 475 Gushing Wound piece per point on a single target is worth noting. You'll notice that there are many corruptions missing from this list. From my testing, none of the other corruptions are worth mentioning or equipping now. Because echoes are fairly easy to obtain, I don't think there's much point in talking about anything other than the top tier corruptions now. Now let's move on to AoE. Twilight Deb is by far the strongest AoE corruption, doing almost twice the damage per point on 5 targets, which is what this data is based off of. Showing up in second place surprisingly is Expedient, outperforming Gushing Wound on 5 targets, and even more as the number of targets goes up. This makes sense because Expedient is going to scale well, as it's increasing the damage of all your dots, so the more targets there are to dot, the more it's going to add. Then follows Gushing Wound, and finally Mind Flayt at the bottom. You can see that this is nearly the reverse of the previous, with Twilight Deb outperforming all others. Now on to healing. Healing wise, corruptions has been pretty lackluster. Per point, the only corruptions worth talking about are Expedient and Masterful. In general, a good rule of thumb for healing is that 2 points of mastery is worth about the same as 3 points of any other stat, but provides 0 benefit to your damage. This means that mastery is your best healing stat, but Masterful may not outperform Expedient if you have a large number of haste procs or items with haste. These stats end up creating a seesaw effect. The more haste you have, the better it is to get mastery, and the more mastery you have, the stronger haste becomes. This means for healing, the best corruption setup is likely a mix between both Masterful and Expedient. So how do we interpret all this data and decide how to balance single target, AoE, and healing? You could draw different conclusions from this data, so I'm going to go over some of the considerations I'm thinking about and what I think the ideal setup is. The first important note is on single target versus AoE damage. At first glance, it might seem that in single target heavy dungeons you run one setup, and in AoE you run another. But it is my belief that you should be favoring single target in almost every dungeon because of the current seasonal affix, Awakened. I did a video review of 3 keys last week, comparing the amount of time that we spent in single targets versus AoE pulls. Because not all pulls are this cut and dry, I decided to weight the pulls slightly depending on the composition. 2 target pulls would be considered mostly single target but not entirely, as well as pulls that consisted of many mobs, but one of the mobs has significantly more health than the others, so that if you focus that mob, all of the others would be dead in the meantime. Think of the first room of Shrine of the Storm as an example. The results I found were a bit surprising. The 3 dungeons I surveyed were Workshop, a single target heavy dungeon, Freehold, a relatively middle ground dungeon, and Shrine of the Storm, which consists of many even health trash pulls. Workshop ended up being 82% to 18%, with 82% of the time in the dungeon spent killing one single mob and 18% of the time on AoE. Freehold was 74% single target and 26% AoE. This result was most surprising to me, but when I watched back the dungeon it made sense. All of the big pulls were centered around big DPS cooldowns, so that they all died within a minute or so, while each boss and obelisk dragged on for a relatively long time. The last dungeon was Shrine, which was 61% single target and 39% AoE. In our route, we do none of the mini bosses, so most of our time is spent fighting trash in large pulls. Even so, the time we spent on single target was more than half the dungeon in one of the most trash-centered dungeons I could find. I'd be really interested to hear what you guys came up with if you did this analysis on your own keys. If this is only specific to our group and the way we pull, or if it's more common. These tests were done on keys at 25 and 26 level during Fortified Bursting Volcanic. With this analysis, I'm fairly certain that single target damage is more valuable for timing keys at a high level by a pretty considerable margin. I believe that even if you personally acquire higher overall in a key, for example by running Formless Major with Focusing Iris and Twilight Dev 4, you're actually completing the dungeon slower. There's obviously a limit to this way of thinking, but considering DPS and tank classes scale better with AoE, I think the healer should be the first to convert to fully single target damage. Next, there is an important factor that all corruptions are not created equal. These sim numbers were formulated with perfect worlds in mind, but in practice, it's very likely that you don't get the full damage benefit from your corruptions. This is because on large, scary pulls, or bosses that you may be focusing on healing and not attacking, and even if you are attacking, your Twilight Dev won't always hit if you're not facing in the right direction or if mobs are too spread. Mind Flay has a similar problem with line of sight and certain dungeon effects killing it, but it isn't as big of a problem as Twilight Dev is. Gushing Wounds is the most consistent, not only with its immediate application, but high proc rate, and in my experience, it is the closest of the three to the perfect world DPS sims. Given that Gushing Wound is already the highest single target corruption, I think it is safe to say that it's a winner for what we want to run if we're looking for damage. Now for our conclusions. The best damage per point is Gushing Wound. The best healing corruption is Masterful, or possibly some combination of Expedient and Masterful, and the best all-around corruption is Expedient. Because dungeons vary in difficulty, I think it'll be a good idea to have two separate item sets. My main set I will use in most dungeons, which consists of 2 to 4 Gushing Wounds and the rest Expedients. At least 2 Gushing Wounds applied to the Carapace boots and Azoth ring, and the rest of the gear filled with Expedient, with potentially 1 or 2 more Gushing Wounds thrown in if I'm looking for even more single target damage. The second item set will be a more healing oriented set, for dungeons that require more healing. Specifically, I'm thinking about Waycrest and Junkyard, but could potentially be used for other dungeons, depending on how high the key levels go this season and what the affixes are. I'll replace the N'Zoth ring with a Haste Mastery and Leecher Avoidance ring with Masterful 3, and potentially 1 or more Expedients with Masterful 3, depending on my final stat numbers. This way you can get a little extra healing boost from your corruption for the dungeons that need it the most. This mostly covers my plan for gearing in the new corruption system. I'm planning on saving my resources for a couple weeks and then eventually purchasing some Gushing Wounds, Expedients, and Masterfuls. I think it's entirely possible that there are other setups that will work as well, but from the research I've done, this seems like the best. If you have different ideas as to what you think would work, I'd be interested to hear suggestions in the comments. Thanks for watching, and happy keying!